On today's episode of One North Maine, Brockton's chapter of NAACP hosted its 33rd annual Dr. Martin Luther King Breakfast with Master of Ceremonies, Bishop Tony Branch. The Cape Verdean Association of Brockton hosted a Dr. Martin Luther King Day event with Master of Ceremonies, Angela Goncalves. So sit back and relax and enjoy a special Black History Month episode of One North Maine.
Did she make the shirts or did you?
We made them together. Chocolate. Gotta love it.
Hello and welcome to One North Maine.
Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people know. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people know. Paul and Silas bound in jail, let my people go. Had nobody for their bell, let my people go. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people go. Paul and Silas began to shout, let my people go. Jail door open and they walked out, let my people go. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people go. Who's that yonder dressed in red? Let my people go. Must be the children that Moses led. Let my people go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people know. Who's that yonder dressed in black? Let my people go. Must be the hypocrites turned in back. Must my people go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people go. I had a little book he gave to me, let my people go. And every page spelled victory, let my people go. Tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain to let my people go.
In June of 1963, President Kennedy traveled to Honolulu to address the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And he did so because he was preparing to file landmark civil rights legislation, and he needed to personally appeal to mayors across the country to support him because he knew it was going to be a big fight. He also traveled all the way to Honolulu to address mayors from across the country. He also used that opportunity to challenge mayors to make change now in their own cities and communities. And so I thought this morning I would share with you some of the remarks that President Kennedy made to mayors to give you some mayor's perspective and where mayors fit in this whole complex world. So it's a very long speech, I'm just going to use a few excerpts, but he describes the legislation that he's proposing and the changes that must be made and what he's going to do on the federal level to the mayors. But then he goes on and he says, such legislation is therefore in your interest, and I hope it will have your support. But the final responsibility, both now and after such legislation is enacted, will still rest with you at the local level. The problem is growing, the challenge is there, the cause is just. The question is whether you will do nothing, thereby inviting pressure and tension and possible violence, or whether you will anticipate these problems and move to fulfill the rights of your Negro citizens in a peaceful and constructive manner. I ask that you act with wisdom and foresight in these matters, not merely to maintain the luster of American ideals, not merely for the peace of the country, but for the good of your own community. And then he went on a little bit later to actually present 5 specific challenges to the mayors. And President Kennedy said, I would suggest at least 5 areas where you can take important actions, referring to the mayors. First, every city can and should establish, preferably through official action by the mayor or governing body, a biracial human relations committee to identify community tensions before they reach the crisis stage, to improve cooperation and communication between the races, and to advise local officials, merchants, and organizations as to what steps can be taken to ensure prompt progress. Today we call that the Diversity Commission. Second, every local government can and should make certain that its own ordinances and practices are in accordance with constitutional law. The Supreme Court has made it clear beyond dispute that no local ordinance requiring segregation is constitutional, whether it applies to schools, zoning, restaurants, places of amusement, either privately or publicly owned. Third, and this one does hit close to home for me as mayor, the president said, every local government can and should follow non-discriminatory practices in the employment and promotion of its municipal workers. And that was President Kennedy in 1963. No group of taxpayers or voters should be excluded from the payrolls of your police, fire, school, and other departments. No city government can expect to understand the views of its Negro citizens, and no Negro community can be expected to look favorably on its city government unless men and women of all races are employed at all levels, supervisory as well as custodial, in all parts of that government. And that's just as true today as it was in 1963. Fourth was every local government can and should enact equal opportunity ordinances to spell out the civil rights of all who live in that community. Ordinances on equal employment opportunity, equal housing opportunities, and equal access to public accommodations. And fifth, JFK said to the mayors, I urge each of you personally to undertake a special campaign this summer to your own community to lessen unemployment among the unskilled of both races by reducing school dropouts. Tell your young people to stay in school. Tell them their chances for steady gainful employment will be far better for every year of schooling. Tell them that unemployment among 16 to 21-year-olds is already at the million mark with more on the way. For as the number of young job seekers grows, the proportion of unskilled jobs drops. And I think we're just as worried about young people 16 to 21 today as we were in 1963. So finally, President Kennedy wrapped up by saying, "In conclusion, may I say this. Improvement of race relations and the fulfillment of human rights is a continuing problem and challenge. I do not propose to limit our mutual concern to this one brief address. I hope to meet with many of you in the White House in the near future. But justice cannot wait for too many meetings. It cannot wait the action of the Congress or even the courts. We face a moment of moral and constitutional crisis, and men of generosity and vision must make themselves heard in every part of the land. I do not say that all men are equal in their ability, character, and motivation. I do say that every American should be given a fair chance to develop in full whatever talents he has and to share equally in the American dream. So on your return from this conference, you can set an example in your communities to which the timid can rally, in which those clinging to the past cannot ignore. I ask you to join with me here and now in recognizing the rights of all Americans, in guiding along constructive channels the attainment of a peaceful revolution which will not only avoid disaster, but fulfill our highest obligations." Those words by JFK nearly 56 years ago still resonate today. So on this day that we celebrate the life and legacy and teachings of Dr. King, I am reminded of Dr. King's words, "The time is always right to do what is right." But I maintain to you today that 56 years later, the time is still right to do what is right. Thank you.
So much of Dr. King's work really pushed for that Voting Rights Act in 1965. So much of his message was that if we can guarantee that right, then all other rights under our Constitution come from that. So when we see in states in the South and the Midwest trying to suppress the rights of individuals to vote, especially in poorer areas, we need to be reminded of the care and the attention that Dr. King gave to that issue. That really is the root and the source of our democracy and of human rights in this country. And we need to make sure that we strive to make our cities and towns a more tolerant and better place to live and work and raise a family. So we need to expand that vision to our entire country and throughout the world and even to the White House. As Dr. King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So we need to protect the right to speak up, especially when that message becomes uncomfortable. We need to stand together as a nation, united in our beliefs, rather than divided in the face of intolerance. We need to strengthen our relationships between our local communities and law enforcement. We need to fight for an equitable and fair justice system, regardless of the differences in race, socioeconomic status, religion, gender, or who we love. We must not let the remarks of elected officials discourage us, but inspire us to serve at the local level and state level and federal level. Hopefully, our work, our example, and our commitment will find its way into the subconscious of our young people. And it's great to see so many young people here this morning, so many children. I hope we can inspire them. I hope we can inspire them to become the next generation of community leaders. So to the Brockton NAACP, to Phyllis Ellis, Tony Branch, thank you for carrying on the legacy of Dr. King and for all you do each day for our community. As Dr. King said, we may have come in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So may God bless the city of Brockton and all of you. May God bless these United States of America. Thank you.
When the Lord comes, it'll be yours, it'll be yours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory.
I think it's fitting that we have something else here in the city on the day of Martin Luther King. I've said this often, that Martin Luther King didn't have to do what he did. He didn't. You know, he had it well off. He was a pastor in a church, a well-respected man. And if he wanted to continue to do that, he could have continued to do that like many others did. But yet, he saw injustice in this country, and he wanted to do something about it. And that's why he did what he did, to a point where he lost his life in protecting people in this country. We often forget that sacrifices are important, but more importantly, we have to recognize those that sacrifice for us.
No, this is truly an honor. Thank you very much for having me here. I've come here the last three years. My colleague, Claire Cronin, was the chairman of Judiciary. She was very instrumental in the criminal justice reform bill that had a very big impact here in Brockton. Just like Dr. King, and she worked very hard to get this bill passed. And we work very well together. And it's just an honor and privilege to be here, so thank you very much. And I see my good friend Phyllis Ellis. She was in charge of the breakfast the other day, and there was 400 people there. And it was just outstanding to see so many. Congressman Lynch was there, and one of his good lines was, "Don't we miss Barack Obama now?" So, thank you.
This is a wonderful celebration of a fine man. You know, we're celebrating in these days Martin Luther King's 90th birthday. He would have been 90 years old. And interestingly, this year, it's 51 years since he died. He died in 1968. So God love him. There were so many years of promise that was cut short by the circumstances of 1968. You know, Martin Luther King was very influenced by Mahatma Gandhi from India, and he adopted his approach of peaceful resistance. We must peaceably resist what we know is wrong in these dark days of the United States. We have a lot of challenges right now. I believe we will get through them by hanging together, by remembering what we all believe in this country, in the goodness of this country. And I thank you all for being here today to honor Martin Luther King's memory. Thank you.
This is actually my second Martin Luther King event as president, and again, also one of my favorite events that we do just because of the meaning behind this day. And last year I talked about servant leadership, right? So it was a message for our elected officials around being a servant leader, just like Martin Luther King was. He was a great leader because he stood for his people. But today, I want to talk to the youth in the room, the young people. Martin Luther King was under the age of 40 when he stood up and chose to take on this fight, to believe in peaceful protests. And I had the pleasure of hearing Michelle Obama speak last April. And she spoke about the recent attitudes and the recent things going on in our political and social world. And she talked about how young people are so frustrated with our current administration, the acts of certain people. And she talked about how that frustration is actually a blessing, because we have a generation that doesn't understand how people can look at each other and not see character, right? We have a whole generation that thinks people are what they do, not what they look like. So it's a blessing for young people, but it's also a call to action. It means that your frustration, the things that make you upset about what people do, when people hurt people, when people fight against people for reasons other than not doing the right thing, we all have a responsibility. And that's what I call on today, is for the young people to take back control and to fight for our rights. Because it's an immigrant issue, it's a race issue, it's a women's issue, and we all have a place to fight for what matters to each and every one of us. Because it's about character and doing the right thing.
This is my first time coming, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Moses, and the Cape Verde Association of Brockton for having me here today. As Moses and Jerry said, we celebrated our anniversary for Martin Luther King on Saturday. It was a great event, but any celebration of Dr. King is a great event. Our theme on Saturday was How High is the Mountain, and your theme today is Reliving a Dream. And I can't wait to hear the rest of the program and the message of Dr. King. He was a great man, yes, he was a leader, fighter, and he kept on fighting. He made the changes as we are today. So I am looking forward to hearing the rest of the program, and thank you for having me. And I will be back next year.
I have a dream.
We are not makers of history, we are made by history.
Only in the darkness can we see the stars.
Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
We may all come from different ships, but we're in the same boat now. We must use time creatively.
Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy to a friend.
The time is always right to do what is right.
Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. Lightning makes no sound until it strikes.
A lie cannot live. Seeing is not always believing.
A lie is the language of the unheard.
A right delayed is a right denied.
I have a dream.
The Bible says, because greater is he that is in you that is in the world. Repeat, in me, there is greatness. So today's theme is to talk about the civil rights struggle. And often when we talk about, I'm a long-winded preacher, I don't need this. Often when we talk about the civil rights struggle, we could talk about the negative and the positive. But often when we define the word relive often brings up, am I reliving something in the negative or am I reliving something in the positive? Now when we talk about the past struggles of civil rights, we're not only talking about lynching, we're not only talking about having exit signs of black and of white. We're talking about a struggle not only to bring people from the back of the bus to the front, but we're talking about a struggle of equality. Someone say equality.
Equality.
Y'all not talking back to me. Someone say equality.
Equality.
So today we seek to talk about the greatness of Dr. King, his life and his achievement. What Moses told me on the telephone is that we should talk about service. Service is often defined as helping somebody. But when it comes to the civil rights struggle, I'm not talking about just helping somebody. The civil rights movement in America must conform to its creed. And I'm going to read his creed. It says, to be a perfect union. It says, one that is inseparable, one that established the principle of freedom, equality, and justice and humanity, that was built on the patriots of the American dream. If you believe that you're a patriot, say patriot.
Patriot.
Now I got a question for you all. Y'all been watching CNN and Fox News, and you recognize and realize that in the midst of the political turmoil in this nation, Dr. King's words must be realized. Dr. King said, now is the time to make the real promises of our democracy. So each and every one of you that have been called to service, and when you see that children have arrived to the border, y'all know what I'm talking about. When you see that they've arrived to the border, then you find out that they have passed on, gone to heaven. The question about your service, are you willing to serve? Are you willing to serve? Y'all not being loud about it. Are you willing to serve? There you go. The promises of America. Come on, somebody. I told you I'll be 7 minutes. I gotta get hyped up. The promises of America always begin in the local. Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local. Do you believe that it's local? Yes. So I'm reminded about a stronger America. A stronger America that is defined by God. Do you believe that? Yes. Y'all not talking back. Do you believe that? Yes. So the promises of America is a question of will you serve? Before you begin the process of serving, one must be reminded that God is stronger in you. Do you believe that God is stronger? Yes. Y'all not saying anything on my right side. Do you believe y'all are stronger? Yes. Secondly, one must define the promise as something that must be focused on. And the promise must be focused on dealing with what is many. But always you must begin with America's future generations, which is the children in this place. Do you believe in focusing on the children? Yes. I'm talking to Brockton, Massachusetts. Do you believe in focusing on the children? Yes. Thirdly, you must begin with Dr. King. Dr. King says that every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and a struggle. It requires the tireless exertion for the dedicated individual. I reject the premise in the city of Brockton that believes that my neighbor is not my friend. I reject the premise in the city of Brockton that believes my neighbor, I can't help him with that struggle. If you believe in your neighbor today, say, I believe in my neighbor. I believe in my neighbor. Talk back to me, I believe in my neighbor. I believe in my neighbor. So one of y'all probably saying, well, why is he so hyped up? Why is he? Because I have ancestors that were strangled. I have ancestors that had to sit in the back of buses. I had ancestors that had to go to special bathrooms. I had ancestors that couldn't get a drink of water. I had ancestors that were told that they weren't equal. I'm upset and excited for these children. If you believe that, say I'm excited. I'm excited. What y'all thought y'all was going to get, amen? So today, will you join me in the service of our children? The question for the city of Brockton, for the politicians that are in this place, in terms of service, are you willing to advance the best educational experience that they may breathe equality? If you believe in breathing equality, say, yes, I do. Yes, I do. So today, will you join in the service of the elderly, making sure that they are sheltered and warm, and that they are assisted in a safe environment? If you believe that, say, yes, I will. Yes, I will. So today, will you join me in the service of the young people, advancing the experience in Brockton, not just by sports, but by a place for them to heal against violence, against suicide, and against the encroachment of drugs. If you believe that, say, yes, I can.